There are moments in history that do not announce themselves with thunder. They do not arrive with banners, armies, or crowns. They slip quietly into the world unnoticed by the powerful, ignored by the comfortable, yet destined to change everything. Bethlehem was such a place. On that night, it was not a city of destiny. It was not a center of learning or power. It was a forgotten village pressed beneath the weight of empire. Its streets worn thin by the footsteps of shepherds and traders. Rome did not watch Bethlehem. Jerusalem barely remembered it. And yet, within that obscurity, eternity leaned into time. The world was not waiting with open arms. It was weary. It was fractured. It was burning, but not with hope. Rome ruled with iron certainty. Peace existed, but only the peace of submission. Taxes crushed the poor. Soldiers enforced order through fear. The powerful prospered, while the forgotten survived. In Jerusalem, religion had become heavy with ritual and hollow with fear. The temple still stood, sacrifices were still offered, prayers were still spoken, but expectation had thinned into routine. The promise of deliverance was spoken of in whispers now, more tradition than hope. And yet, into this exhausted world, a light was born. Not in a palace, not among priests or kings, but in a borrowed space meant for animals. The child did not arrive with applause. There were no royal processions, no political announcements. Heaven did not consult earth's permission. God entered history quietly, wrapped in vulnerability, breathing the same cold night air as the poor. This was not how anyone expected salvation to look. The mother was young, too young, many would say. Her story would raise eyebrows and invite suspicion. The father was present, but not by blood. His obedience would cost him reputation, safety, and certainty. Together, they stood at the edge of something they did not fully understand, carrying a promise older than nations. The child lay in a manger not because it was symbolic, but because there was no room elsewhere. The world was full of ambition, full of power, full of noise. There was no space prepared for God, and yet, heaven did not turn back. Outside the village, shepherds kept watch over their flocks. These were not men of influence or education. Their testimony carried little weight in courts or temples. They lived on the margins, ritually unclean, socially invisible. And yet, they were the first to hear the announcement that would reshape the universe. Light shattered the darkness of their night. Fear gripped them as the sky filled with glory not of this world. Words echoed across the fields, words of joy, of good news, of a child born not just for Israel, but for all people. The message was simple, yet impossible. Salvation had arrived. Not as a warrior, not as a judge, but as a baby. They ran toward Bethlehem not to a throne, but to a feeding trough. And there, they found exactly what heaven had promised. The light had entered the world, but light does not exist without confrontation. Where it shines, shadows recoil. Far from Bethlehem, another man lay awake. A king by title, but not by peace. Power had made him paranoid. Authority had made him afraid. The rumors of a newborn king disturbed him not because he believed in prophecy, but because he feared competition. To him, power was a possession to be defended, not a responsibility to be stewarded. While shepherds rejoiced, rulers trembled. In Jerusalem, whispers began to circulate. Something was happening. Ancient promises stirred in the air. Scholars searched scrolls, priests debated meanings. The city that should have recognized its own Messiah felt uneasy instead. Light had drawn near, but it exposed more than it comforted. Because light reveals, it reveals fear masquerading as faith. It reveals power pretending to be righteousness. It reveals hearts hardened by control. Bethlehem glowed quietly, but Jerusalem felt the heat. This child did not threaten Rome's legions. He carried no sword. Yet his existence challenged every throne built on fear, every system sustained by injustice, every religion emptied of compassion. His life would not dismantle empires by force, but by truth. The fire had been lit. It did not roar yet. It flickered small, fragile, easily dismissed, but fire does not need permission to spread. From that manger flowed a story that would move from village to city, from city to cross, from cross to empty tomb. The light born in Bethlehem would soon walk the streets of Jerusalem, teaching with authority that unsettled the learned and healed the broken. And when Jerusalem finally tried to extinguish that light, it would discover a truth written into the fabric of eternity. Light cannot be killed, it multiplies. That night in Bethlehem was not an ending, it was an ignition. The world did not change immediately. Rome still ruled, poverty remained, injustice endured. But something irreversible had begun. God had stepped inside the human story, not to observe it, but to redeem it from within. And the fire that began in obscurity would soon demand a response from kings, from cities, from hearts. Because once light enters the darkness, neutrality is no longer possible. And as the child grew, so did the tension between light and shadow, truth and power, heaven and hardened hearts. That is where the story moves next. The child did not remain hidden forever. Years passed quietly in a small town few would ever visit by choice. The light that entered the world in Bethlehem grew in silence, shaped not by palaces, but by poverty, not by scholars, but by obedience. Hands that once grasped hay would learn the weight of wood. Feet that took first steps in dust would one day walk roads worn by the broken and forgotten. Nazareth offered no shortcuts to greatness. There were no signs, no miracles, no proclamations from heaven. Just ordinary days, and that was the scandal of it all. God did not rush his revelation. The world burned with impatience, but heaven moved with purpose. The light waited, it listened. It learned the rhythm of human life work, fatigue, hunger, celebration, grief. The Son of God knew what it meant to grow tired, to be misunderstood, to labor without applause. Redemption was not rushed, it was embodied. Then one day, the waiting ended, the light stepped forward. It began not in Jerusalem, but at the edge among fishermen, laborers, and the overlooked. The first words spoken publicly were not political demands or religious threats, but an invitation: repent, for the kingdom of God has drawn near, not built by force, not enforced by law. Near enough to touch, near enough to enter. People listened. Some leaned in with hope, others recoiled with suspicion. The light did not flatter power. It exposed it. It did not affirm comfort. It disrupted it. Those who believed themselves righteous felt uneasy in its presence. Those who knew they were broken felt seen. The poor heard dignity in his voice. The sick found restoration in his touch. The condemned discovered mercy where they expected judgment. And everywhere he went, fire followed, not the fire of destruction, but the fire of awakening. Fishermen left their nets, tax collectors abandoned their booths. Women, long silenced by custom, found their voices restored. Sinners were not excused, but transformed. Forgiveness did not lower the standard, it raised the soul. This light did not blend into the world, it confronted it. He spoke of a father who loved prodigals more than appearances, of a kingdom where the last would be first, where enemies were to be loved, where humility carried more weight than lineage. These words unsettled the religious elite. They had mastered the law but forgotten its heart. The light did not accuse them without cause. It simply shone, and light makes shadows obvious. Crowds grew, stories spread, hope ignited, but so did fear. Jerusalem began to watch. The city of kings and prophets had seen movements rise and fall before. Rome tolerated religion as long as it did not threaten order. The temple authorities tolerated teaching as long as it did not challenge control. But this was different. This teacher did not seek permission. He did not align with parties. He did not endorse power. He claimed authority, not borrowed, not inherited, intrinsic. When he spoke, scripture sounded alive again. When he healed, it was not magic, it was restoration. When he forgave, It was not symbolic, it was personal. And when he spoke of the kingdom, it was not distant, it was present. Jerusalem could feel it drawing closer. The light that began in Bethlehem was now walking roads that led inevitably to the city of decision. Every miracle intensified the tension. Every parable sharpened the divide. Neutrality became impossible. One either followed or resisted. Some tried to trap him with questions. Others plotted quietly. Power rarely attacks truth openly at first. The fire burned brighter. He spoke of seeds growing unseen, of yeast working through dough, of light set on a hill that could not be hidden. And though he never raised a weapon, his words dismantled illusions. The true enemy was not Rome, he implied, but hardened hearts. Not oppression alone, but sin that corrupted from within. That was dangerous language, because it meant everyone was accountable. As Passover approached, Jerusalem filled with pilgrims. The city swelled with memory of liberation from Egypt, of God's saving power. Expectations thickened the air. This was the season when hope sharpened into longing, when ancient promises felt close enough to taste. And the light was coming, not quietly this time. Whispers followed him up the road, the healer, the prophet, the teacher. Some dared to wonder if he was more, others braced for disappointment. The city had been broken by false messiahs before, but no one could deny this. Something irreversible was unfolding. When he finally entered Jerusalem, the response was volcanic. Praise erupted from the streets, palms waved. Voices cried out for salvation. The city that had slept through his birth could no longer ignore his presence. The light had reached the center, but fire in the heart of a city reveals what lies beneath. What burned in Jerusalem was not unity, but conflict. The same crowds that celebrated him unsettled the authorities. The temple, meant to be a house of prayer, had become a marketplace of exploitation. And when the light confronted it, tables fell, coins scattered, silence shattered. This was no longer safe admiration. This was confrontation. Jerusalem burned not with revival yet, but with resistance. The light did not retreat, it pressed closer. Because fire does not exist to comfort shadows, it exists to consume lies. And as the days unfolded, lines were drawn, loyalty was tested, fear whispered in corridors of power. Decisions were made in darkness, while truth stood openly in the light. The fire that began in Bethlehem had reached its most dangerous point not because it was weak, but because it was unstoppable. And Jerusalem would soon choose how to respond. Jerusalem did not fall asleep that week. The city hummed with tension, its streets thick with pilgrims and suspicion. Songs of worship drifted through the air, but beneath them lay unease and awareness that something fragile was being tested. The light that had entered the city had not softened it, it had exposed it. Power does not fear violence as much as it fears truth. Every word he spoke now was measured, every movement watched. The authorities no longer debated whether he was dangerous. They debated how to remove him without igniting revolt. Rome demanded order. The temple demanded control. And the light stood between them calm, unafraid, unyielding. He knew what awaited him. This was not an accident of history. This was intention. The fire did not stumble into suffering, it walked toward it. On the night of the Passover, he gathered with those closest to him. The room was small, the atmosphere heavy. Ancient symbols filled the table: bread, wine, remembrance. But he spoke of them differently now. The words carried weight they had never carried before. This is my body. This is my blood. They did not fully understand, but they felt the gravity of the moment. Love knelt before them and washed their feet, teacher serving student, master lowering himself beneath pride. Even then, betrayal sat quietly among them, unresolved, unnoticed by all but him. The fire does not expose only enemies. It reveals friends too. When the night deepened, he went to pray. The garden was silent, save for the sound of anguish pressed into the earth. The light that had healed thousands now wrestled alone. This was not fear of death, it was the weight of obedience. to absorb humanity's darkness without becoming it, to drink suffering without spilling love. Not my will, but yours. And heaven was silent. The arrest came swiftly, torches cut through the dark. Kisses masked betrayal. Steel met flesh, chaos erupted, but the light did not resist. No angels descended, no escape was attempted. The fire allowed itself to be bound, because redemption requires surrender. By morning, Jerusalem was awake. Trials followed, religious, political, public. Truth was twisted. Witnesses lied. Justice bent beneath convenience. He stood accused by those whose power he threatened, condemned by a crowd whose hopes he refused to fulfill on their terms. Crucify him. The city chose silence over truth, order over righteousness, safety over salvation. The fire was led outside the city walls. The cross was not invented for mercy. It was designed to humiliate, to break, to warn others, not to challenge power. Rome perfected it. Victims were stripped of dignity, reduced to warnings carved in flesh. And there, between criminals, the light was lifted up. This was the moment darkness had waited for. Mockery rained down, priests sneered, soldiers gambled. The crowd watched. The earth seemed to hold its breath as the fire bled. But even here, the light burned. Father, forgive them, it is finished. These were not words of defeat. They were declarations of completion. The fire did not flicker, it transferred. What looked like extinction was ignition at a deeper level. When he breathed his last, the sky reacted. The ground shook. The temple curtain tore not from bottom to top, but from top to bottom. Separation ended. Access opened. God was no longer distant. The fire had passed through death. Jerusalem thought the problem was solved. The body was buried. The stone was sealed. Guards stood watch. Power exhaled. Darkness congratulated itself. Another movement extinguished. Another threat neutralized. But darkness misunderstood the nature of light. Fire does not die when it is spread. The cross did not end the story, it detonated it. What happened outside the city walls did not remain there. The death meant to silence truth became the proof of it. The blood meant to shame became the seal of a new covenant. The grave meant to contain hope became the doorway through which eternity would break back into time. And though Jerusalem slept, the fire was already moving. It moved through grief-stricken hearts, through shattered expectations, through silence that felt unbearable. Because light waits but never retreats. The city had chosen the cross over the kingdom, but the kingdom had already chosen resurrection, and the fire that seemed extinguished was about to return not as a flicker, but as a flame no stone, no empire, no grave could contain. Jerusalem woke to an impossible rumor. It did not come from the palace. It did not rise from the temple courts. It whispered its way through alleys, homes, and broken hearts. The tomb was empty. At first, it sounded like grief speaking nonsense. Hope, crushed to suddenly, often tries to resurrect itself with stories. But the witnesses were not dreamers. They were the same ones who had fled in fear, who had hidden behind locked doors, who had watched the fire die on a cross. They had no reason to fabricate courage, yet something had changed. The light had returned not cautiously, not symbolically, but alive. Death had done its worst and failed. The fire that passed through the grave emerged untouched, transformed, irreversible. What Jerusalem believed it had silenced now stood beyond its reach. Resurrection was not a reversal of suffering. It was its conquest. The risen Christ did not storm the city with vengeance. He did not expose his enemies or reclaim honor. He returned quietly to gardens, to roads, to meals shared with friends. The fire burned with the same humility it always had, but now with uncontainable authority. Fear dissolved. Those who once ran now stood firm. Cowardice melted into courage. Broken men and women spoke with clarity they had never possessed. They did not argue theories. They bore witness. We have seen him. Jerusalem felt the heat again. This time, it was not crowds waving palms, it was a movement rising from within, not organized by power, not sustained by wealth, but driven by conviction that death was no longer final and fear no longer necessary. When the fire descended again, this time not on a manger or a cross, but on people, it did not consume them, it filled them. Language barriers shattered. Walls of division cracked. The message spilled into the streets: Jesus lives. The city that had executed the light now faced its multiplication. Threats followed, arrests came, beatings were endured. But something had shifted forever. The fire no longer rested in one body, it burned in many. Jerusalem could not imprison it. Rome could not legislate it. Violence could not erase it. Because fire shared is fire strengthened. From Jerusalem it spread across deserts, seas, and centuries, into catacombs and cathedrals, through persecution and revival, through whispered prayers and shouted praise. Empires rose and fell, but the light endured. It burned in martyrs who sang while dying, in reformers who defied corruption, in ordinary people who loved when hatred was easier. And now it burns still, not as memory, not as myth, but as living presence. The fire that began in Bethlehem confronts every generation with the same question Jerusalem faced: what will you do with the light? Will you resist it to protect comfort? Will you ignore it to preserve control? Or will you allow it to burn, purify, reshaping, awakening? Because this light does not force entry. It invites surrender. It burns away lies we cling to. It warms wounds we hide. It ignites courage we never knew we had. The fire is not behind us, it is within reach. It burns in forgiveness that defies logic, in hope that survives despair, in love that refuses to hate. The manger, the cross, the empty tomb, these are not relics of a distant past. They are the pattern of transformation still at work. God enters the ordinary, light confronts darkness. Fire passes through death and emerges victorious. Bethlehem lit the flame, Jerusalem tried to extinguish it. But the world caught fire, and now the question is not whether the light still burns, it is whether we will carry it. Because fire does not exist to be admired, it exists to be shared. And the light of Bethlehem, once fragile, once rejected, once crucified, burns still in us. This is not the end of the story. It is the continuation, and the fire is not finished. The light that was born in Bethlehem was never meant to remain a memory. It was not confined to a manger, silenced by a cross, or contained by a tomb. It moved through fear, through death, through history, and it still moves now. Jerusalem learned that truth cannot be buried, and darkness cannot outlast the light that God ignites. What began as a fragile flame became an eternal fire, carried not by empires, but by transformed lives. This story is not only about what happened then, it is about what is happening now. Every heart that chooses hope over fear, love over hatred, truth over comfort, becomes another place where the fire burns. The light of Christ still calls, still confronts, still heals. And the question remains, not for cities or kings, but for us. If this story moved you, like this video, subscribe for more powerful biblical stories, share it with someone who needs light today, and drop a comment: how does this fire burn in you?